With this updated version of Kairos Systems, you now have the option to integrate a tablet with the ability to have patients fill out their patient details, medical history and consent forms, all with electronic signature capture. These forms are automatically synced with the system and are stored in the patient's record with a date stamp. The tablet can also be used for anonymous feedback forms. To send the forms for the relevant patient to the tablet, go to the diary and right-click on the patient for the drop-down menu of options. You will see at the bottom the option to register with tablet. Selecting this option, you will then have three further options: patient details, medical history and consent forms. Let us start with patient details. By clicking on this option, the patient details form for the patient have been sent to the tablet. On the tablet, this is the view the receptionist or patient will be presented with. The receptionist or patient taps on patient details and the name of the patient appears. The patient then taps on their name and they are presented with a form relating to their details to complete. If prior to the appointment some of the patient details have already been inputted into the system, they will appear on the form on the tablet. The patient, of course, still can edit these aspects if, say, for example, their name was misspelt when taken over the phone. Once the patient has completed the form, at the bottom is an electronic signature capture. The patient signs the document and presses submit. If they make a mistake, there is a clear button for them to give their signature again. Pressing submit brings up a screen indicating that the patient has successfully submitted their form. The details the patient has submitted automatically updates their details in their records. The patient is then asked to hand the device back to reception. Even if they do not and press the return button themselves, they are unable to navigate across the tablet as it is pinned, which protects the details of other patients that may be in the practice that day. The receptionist then enters the PIN that was decided by the practice and the tablet returns to the home screen. Now let us send a medical history form to the tablet for the patient to complete. Go to their appointment in the diary, right-click, select the option Register with Tablet and then choose the option Medical History. On the tablet, choose Medical History and then the patient's name appears. Tap on the patient's name and a medical history form appears for the patient to fill out. As this is a new patient, the medical history form they are presented with is blank. However, if it is a returning patient, the last medical history form they completed appears so that they can quickly check if their medical history is up to date and make any necessary changes. The medical history form you see here has been created by Kairos Systems. In housekeeping, you're able to create your own medical history form. Let us say this patient has an allergy to penicillin, as then later on in the process we can see how Kairos Systems merges medical conditions declared on the medical history form in the patient's record. At the bottom of the medical history form is the electronic signature capture. If it is a new patient has filled out the form or a returning patient with no changes to their medical history, they would sign the form and press submit. However, if it is a returning patient with no changes to their medical history form, they would press the No Change button as they did not make any changes to the medical history form above. The successfully submitted screen appears and the patient hands over the tablet to reception. The medical history has now been automatically stored in the patient's record in the Medical Conditions and History tab. As you can see, it is now listed in the Medical Histories table with today's date stamp. Click on the medical history and it brings up the details of the medical history in the table to the right. Right-clicking on the medical history in the Medical Histories table brings up a drop-down menu with a series of options. Select the option to merge with medical conditions. As you can now see in the table labelled Conditions, a medical condition has been added with today's date stamp. Clicking on the medical condition brings up the details to the right. The details are preset in housekeeping when you define your medical conditions. As you can see here, under action, if any required, the instructions do not give penicillin are stipulated. This action is inputted when the medical condition is defined and is a generic action for all patients presenting with this medical condition. Under patient note will appear any details the patient gave to relating to their medical condition. For example, if they are on medication, the dose may be stipulated. This box can also be edited by users of Chiral systems to add actions relating to the medical condition individually for the patient. For example, the patient may have the medical condition of diabetes. In action, if any required, the generic action to be taken by the provider could be to check that all necessary drugs have been taken prior to the appointment. However, for this particular patient that presents with diabetes, you may wish to put in an individual action and patient note, and that action could be to check that the patient has eaten prior to the appointment. As the patient has a medical condition, in status there is a red flag flashing that will appear in the relevant parts of the patient's records to indicate to any providers carrying out dental treatment that they need to check the patient's medical conditions. If you wish to create your own template for the medical history form, it can be created in Housekeeping under the Medical Conditions tab. Under Name, right-click, which will bring up a drop-down menu from which you can choose the option to add medical condition. This brings up the following dialog box. In Name, you choose the name of the medical condition. Under Severity, you have the option to choose from Information, Hazard and Warning. In Description, you have the option to add a description about the medical condition. In Action, if any required, you can input a generic action to be taken across the board for patients that present with this medical condition. And in Form Text, you can input the question you would like to appear on the medical history form. For example, if we right-click on alcohol and choose the option to edit medical condition, you can see from the action, if any required, that for all patients consuming over a certain amount of units per week, they are to be given alcohol reduction advice, and that in Form Text, the question relating to alcohol will appear on the medical history form as, do you drink alcoholic beverages? If yes, please specify in comments typical unit consumption per week. You also have the option to remove medical conditions by right-clicking on them and then choosing Delete Medical Condition from the drop-down menu. To have these medical conditions appear in your medical history form, highlight the necessary medical condition from the Conditions table and choose Add to have the medical condition appear in the medical history form content. To remove any medical conditions from the medical history form content, simply highlight the medical condition and click on the Remove button. To decide the order in which medical conditions appear on the medical history form, simply select the condition by highlighting them and move them up and down using the arrow keys to the left of the table. As these are large changes you are making in housekeeping, after you have clicked on the blue floppy disk to save your changes, close down and reopen Chiral Systems. This procedure needs to be done when major changes are made to the system. The reason for closing and reopening Chiral Systems is because that if major changes were allowed to be saved without closing and reopening, Chiral Systems would run slower on your computer. For consent forms, go to the patient's appointment in the diary. Right-click and choose Register from Tablet from the drop-down menu and then click on Consent Forms. This then brings up a dialog box from which you choose which consent forms you need the patient to sign. Click on the relevant form or forms and press OK. Then, on the tablet, under Consent Forms, the patient's name will appear. They tap on their name and the relevant consent form or consent forms are there for them to read and give consent to with the electronic signature capture. The patient also needs to actively select either the I do give consent button or the I do not give consent button. If they do give consent, sign the form and submit it. The form is then automatically stored in the patient's documents under consent forms. As you can see, the consent forms are listed with the date they were created on, who by, the name of the consent form with any relevant notes. It is not possible to edit these consent forms, so they fulfil medico-legal obligations in that revisions cannot be made retrospectively, protecting both the patient and provider. Clicking on the consent form will bring up the view of what the consent form would look like printed with the signature. You can also ask the receptionist to give a patient consent forms to fill out after they have completed treatment from their appointment with the patient handover button. From the patient handover button, you can choose the option to ask the receptionist to give the patient a consent form for any future treatment you wish the patient to undergo. This will appear as a diary task for the receptionist to action. They would then go to the patient's appointment in the diary to register the consent form with the patient for them to complete. Consent forms are created in housekeeping in the Patient Consent Forms tab. Clicking on a consent form from the consent form table will bring up the details below. It will display the content of the consent form as well as the details of the disclaimer if one is added. For example, your disclaimer may read, "By signing this consent form, I agree that I have read and understood all the implications of the above treatment." You would then also stipulate the give consent message and deny consent message. In the consent form table, right-clicking produces a drop-down menu with Add, Edit and Delete Consent Form. Clicking on Add Consent Form brings up the following dialog box. Here you name the consent form, add a description and comments if you so wish, and in the large box add the content of your consent form. Then you can add a disclaimer, stipulate the give consent message and deny consent message, as well as choose the template for which the consent form follows. These templates can be set up to have your logo. Selecting OK will create the consent form, and selecting Cancel will discard the consent form. Do not forget to press Save once you have created your consent form and to close down and reopen Chiral Systems, as this is a major change you have made to the system. The tablet can also be used to fulfill your CQC requirements of collecting anonymous feedback from your patients. Simply hand the patient the tablet and ask them to choose the feedback section to leave feedback. This form also fulfills the NHS requirement of the Friends and Family test by having the experience question of using the service listed first. There is also the option not to have their comment made public if they so wish. The questions on the form are those the CQC looks for when inspecting your practice. The patient answers the questions using the slider. Below, there is the option to input further data that the NHS asks for in feedback questionnaires. Finally, there is the additional comments box where patients can leave any feedback the practice may find useful. Pressing Submit will anonymously submit this data to Chiral Systems. To access this data, go to Patients from the written menu bar at the top of the Chiral Systems window and choose Feedback.